The Georgia sun blazed mercilessly through the Venetian blinds of Colonel James Mitchell's office, casting sharp lines across the polished mahogany desk where Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Rodriguez's dismissal papers lay waiting. The clock on the wall ticked with mechanical precision 08:00 hours on a Tuesday that would change everything. Outside, the sounds of Fort Benning's morning routine continued. Drill sergeants barking orders, boots marching in perfect synchronization, and the distant crack of rifle fire from the training ranges where Maria had spent countless hours perfecting skills that apparently meant nothing to the men who now deemed her unworthy. Maria stood at rigid attention, her desert combat boots positioned precisely shoulder-width apart, spine straight as a steel rod, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond Colonel Mitchell's graying temples. Her uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every ribbon and badge positioned with mathematical precision. 3 months of the most grueling military training known to the American Armed Forces, and it all came down to this sterile office conversation that would end her dreams with the stroke of a pen. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Mitchell began, his voice carrying the weight of administrative finality that every soldier dreaded. His thick fingers drummed against the desk surface, a nervous habit he'd developed during 23 years of military service, most of it spent making decisions that affected other people's lives. "After careful consideration and evaluation of the program's current needs, we've decided to reassign you to a different unit, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, acrid and suffocating. Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign that the decision hit her like a physical blow. She had known this moment was coming. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the mess hall, the pointed looks from her male classmates, the way certain instructors seemed to find fault with performances that would have earned praise if delivered by anyone else. The U.S. Army Sniper School had been accepting women for exactly 18 months, but acceptance on paper and acceptance in reality were two entirely different battles. "The official reason for your reassignment," Mitchell continued, consulting the folder before him with the practiced indifference of a man who had delivered similar news hundreds of times, "is administrative restructuring within the specialized training programs. Your service record indicates exemplary performance in previous assignments, and I'm confident you'll find success in your new position with the 82nd Airborne Division's Logistics Battalion." Logistics Battalion. The words tasted like ashes in Maria's mouth. From the precision world of long-range marksmanship to counting supplies and managing inventories, it was a professional death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. She understood the real message perfectly. They were burying her in paperwork where her inconvenient presence wouldn't challenge the established order or make anyone uncomfortable. "Sir, may I ask if this decision is based on my performance evaluations?" Maria's voice remained steady, professional, though every fiber of her being wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. Her scores had been consistently in the top 5% of her class. Her physical fitness evaluations exceeded standards. Her written examinations demonstrated mastery of ballistics, meteorology, and tactical planning that impressed even veteran instructors. Colonel Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the springs creaking under his weight. This was the part of command he despised, the careful dance around uncomfortable truths that couldn't be spoken aloud in official proceedings. "Your performance has been adequate, Sergeant. However, certain concerns have been raised about unit cohesion and the overall training environment." Unit cohesion. The euphemism hung between them like a loaded weapon. Maria had heard the complaints, filtered through the chain of command, but originating from her male classmates, who couldn't handle the idea of a woman outperforming them in their sacred brotherhood. Complaints about distractions and inappropriate dynamics that had nothing to do with her professional conduct and everything to do with fragile egos that cracked when confronted with her superior abilities. "I see, sir." Maria's response was measured, careful. She had learned long ago that protesting such decisions only provided ammunition for those who claimed women were too emotional for elite military positions. Better to maintain dignity and professionalism, even in defeat. As she prepared to salute and leave, Maria adjusted the worn leather rifle case slung across her right shoulder, the case that had accompanied her through 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, through countless training exercises, through sleepless nights when she cleaned and maintained her weapon with the devotion of a monk tending to sacred relics. The case showed its age, weathered brown leather softened by desert sand and mountain moisture, reinforced stitching that she had repaired herself during quiet moments between missions, and along its edge, a series of small, deliberate marks that most people assumed were decorative scratches. Colonel Mitchell's eyes caught those marks for the first time, drawn by the way the morning sunlight illuminated their precise, intentional pattern. They weren't random scratches or wear marks. They were too uniform, too purposeful. Each mark was exactly the same size, carved with surgical precision into the leather. He counted them quickly, 47 small notches arranged in groups of 5, like a prisoner counting days on a cell wall. "Sergeant," he called as Maria's hand reached for the door handle. "That's an interesting rifle case. Custom work?" Maria paused, her hand frozen on the brass handle. "Yes, sir. Built it myself during my first deployment." "And those marks along the edge decorative?" The question hung in the air for several heartbeats. Maria turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting Mitchell's pale blue ones. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that this conversation was about to veer into territory neither had anticipated. "No, sir," Maria replied quietly. "They're not decorative." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying the young woman before him with new interest. 26 years old. According to her file, born in East Los Angeles to parents who had immigrated from El Salvador before she was born. Father deceased Vietnam veteran who died from complications related to Agent Orange exposure. Mother working double shifts as a hospital cleaner to support Maria's younger siblings. Clean service record. 2 combat deployments, recommendations. For promotion from every commanding officer she'd served under. But those marks on her rifle case suggested a story that wasn't captured in any official documentation. "What do they represent, Sergeant?" Maria's pause stretched longer this time. The weight of secrets carried across 2 deployments, across missions that never appeared in after-action reports, across moments when she had pulled triggers that ended lives to save lives. The Army had used her skills when convenient and ignored them when politically expedient. Now, faced with dismissal from the one program where those skills should have been celebrated, she found herself at a crossroads between continued silence and dangerous honesty. "Confirmed kills, sir. Taliban fighters. All verified by my commanding officers during Operations Enduring Freedom." The words dropped into the office like grenades, their impact reverberating in the sudden silence that followed. Colonel Mitchell's face went through several color changes, from mild interest to surprise to something approaching shock. His fingers stopped drumming. The ticking clock seemed to grow louder. "How many?" he asked, though he had already counted the marks. 47, sir." The number hung between them like an accusation. 47 confirmed kills meant Maria Rodriguez possessed more combat experience than most of Mitchell's instructors. It meant she had been operating as an unofficial sniper for 2 full deployments, while officially classified as regular infantry. It meant the woman he was dismissing for administrative reasons might be one of the most naturally gifted marksmen the Army had produced in a generation. Mitchell's mind raced through the implications. If Rodriguez's claims were true and something in her steady, Gaze suggested they were. Then he was looking at a soldier who had been systematically underutilized and underrecognized by a military bureaucracy too rigid to adapt to exceptional talent when it came packaged differently than expected. "I think, Sergeant Rodriguez," he said slowly, "we need to have a much longer conversation about your service record." As Maria set her rifle case down and took the seat Mitchell gestured toward, neither of them could have imagined that this moment, this collision between bureaucratic dismissal and undeniable truth, would ultimately reshape not just their own careers, but the entire future of women in America's most elite military programs. The leather chair in Colonel Mitchell's office suddenly felt like a confessional as Maria Rodriguez found herself transported back 26 months to the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan's Kandahar province. The fluorescent lights overhead dimmed in her memory, replaced by the harsh glare of a desert sun that had beaten down mercilessly on Forward Operating Base Chapman, where her story truly began. "It started with my father," Maria said quietly, her hands resting on her knees, as she stared past Mitchell toward memories that haunted her dreams. "Master Sergeant Eduardo Rodriguez, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam 1968 to 1970. He came home with 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and lungs that were slowly being eaten alive by Agent Orange. But before the government chemicals killed him, he taught me something the Army couldn't: how to make impossible shots when lives depended on it." Mitchell leaned forward, his earlier irritation at paperwork delays forgotten. The woman sitting across from his desk was no longer just another personnel problem to be shuffled between units. She was a puzzle piece that might redefine everything he thought he knew about modern warfare and the soldiers who fought it. "Every weekend from age 12 until I enlisted," Maria continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of someone recounting a sacred ritual, "we'd drive his beat-up Ford pickup 3 hours into the Mojave Desert. He'd set up targets at distances that seemed impossible, empty beer cans at 400 yards, playing cards tacked to Joshua trees at 600, sometimes weathered fence posts barely visible at 800 yards or more. While other kids were at soccer practice or hanging out at malls, I was learning to read wind patterns in the way desert grass bent, calculating bullet drop based on temperature and humidity, understanding that every shot was a mathematical equation, written in physics and solved with perfect stillness." The memories came flooding back with crystalline clarity, her father's patient voice explaining how a bullet's trajectory curved like a rainbow, how the Earth's rotation, the Coriolis effect, could pull a long-range shot inches off target, how breathing had to become as controlled and deliberate as a monk's meditation. Eduardo Rodriguez had been a sniper in Vietnam's deadliest valleys, and he passed that deadly artistry to his daughter with the devotion of a master craftsman training his successor. "My father died 6 months before I deployed to Afghanistan," Maria said, her voice catching almost imperceptibly. "Lung cancer. Before he passed, he gave me his spotting scope, a Leupold Mark IV, that had served him through 2 tours in Southeast Asia. He made me promise that if I ever found myself in a position where American lives depended on precision shooting, I wouldn't hesitate to use everything he'd taught me." Maria paused, her eyes refocusing on Colonel Mitchell's office, as the weight of that promise settled between them like a shared burden. Outside, the sounds of Fort Benning continued, vehicles rumbling past, distant explosions from the artillery. Range, the constant background hum of military life that never truly stopped. "February 2019, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan," she resumed, her voice now carrying the precision of an after-action report. "I was assigned to Bravo Company's 2nd Battalion, 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team. Officially, I was a designated marksman, basically an infantry soldier with better than average shooting skills assigned to provide accurate fire support at distances up to 500 meters. Nothing fancy, nothing that would challenge anyone's preconceptions about women in combat roles. But reality, as Maria learned within days of arriving at Bob Chapman, had little respect for official job descriptions or bureaucratic comfort zones. Our company commander, Captain Sarah Chun, was one of those rare officers who cared more about results than politics, Maria explained. When she reviewed our personnel files and saw my marksmanship scores from basic training perfect scores, that her previous designated marksmen couldn't match on their best days, she started asking questions. Where did I learn to shoot? Had I ever engaged targets beyond standard infantry distances? Did I have experience with precision rifle systems? Mitchell found himself leaning forward, drawn into a story that was reshaping his understanding of how modern combat actually functioned, versus how it was supposed to function according to military doctrine and congressional oversight committees. Captain, Chun had a problem, Maria continued. The Taliban in our sector had become incredibly sophisticated. They were using IEDs triggered from distances exceeding 600 meters, placing snipers in elevated positions that our standard weapons couldn't effectively engage, and conducting harassment operations from ranges where they felt completely safe from retaliation. American soldiers were dying because the enemy understood something our leadership didn't want to acknowledge. In asymmetric warfare, the side with better long-range precision holds a decisive advantage. The solution emerged through a combination of necessity, innovation, and Captain Chun's willingness to bend regulations when American lives hung in the balance. Rather than request a trained sniper from higher command, a process that could take weeks and might be denied entirely, she authorized Maria to modify her standard-issue M4 rifle using components requisitioned through creative interpretations of equipment maintenance protocols. I spent every off-duty hour for 2 weeks building what became my signature weapon, Maria said, a hint of pride creeping into her professional tone. A precision barrel that extended effective range to over 800 meters. A custom scope mount that could accommodate my father's Vietnam-era Leupold, a bipod system that provided rock-steady stability, and modifications to the trigger mechanism. That reduced pull weight to exactly 2 pounds. It wasn't officially a sniper rifle, but it could perform like one when properly employed. The first test of Maria's improvised precision system came during a routine convoy escort mission that turned into anything but routine. Intelligence had suggested the route between Bob Chapman and a remote outpost called Firebase Granite was relatively secure, assessment that proved catastrophically wrong when Taliban fighters initiated a complex ambush in a narrow valley, designated on military maps as Grid Square 42 SVD 12,345 67,890. March 15, 2019, Maria said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper as she recalled details that had been classified in official reports, but burned into her memory with perfect clarity. 0347 hours, approximately 12 kilometers southeast of Bob Chapman. Our convoy consisted of 4 vehicles carrying supplies and personnel rotation for Firebase Granite. I was riding in the 3rd vehicle, providing security through an improvised fighting position in the truck bed. The ambush had been expertly planned and executed. Taliban fighters positioned themselves on elevated ground, flanking the convoy route. With overlapping fields of fire that created a deadly crossfire zone. The lead vehicle struck an improvised explosive device at the precise moment when small arms fire erupted from positions that had been carefully prepared and camouflaged. Within 30 seconds, we had 2 vehicles disabled, 4 soldiers wounded, and hostile fire coming from at least 8 different positions. Maria continued, her hands unconsciously mimicking the movements of checking equipment and acquiring targets. Our return fire was ineffective because the enemy positions were beyond the effective range of our standard weapons. They had chosen their ground perfectly close enough to hit us with devastating accuracy, far enough away to be relatively safe from our response. That was the moment when months of desert training with her father combined with the precision weapon she had painstakingly assembled, transformed Maria Rodriguez from a designated marksman into something the Taliban would learn to fear. I identified the primary threat, a machine gun position approximately 650 meters upslope from our location, she said. The gunner was systematically engaging our disabled vehicles, and I could see muzzle flashes that indicated he was using armor-piercing ammunition that could penetrate our vehicle protection. If that position wasn't neutralized quickly, we were going to start losing people. Maria's first shot as an unofficial sniper in Afghanistan would establish a pattern that would define her next 18 months of deployment. One shot, one kill, at a distance that impressed even veteran soldiers who witnessed it. The machine gunner dropped with my first round, she said simply. But taking out one position only revealed how many others were waiting. What followed was the longest 15 minutes of my life, systematically identifying and engaging hostile positions, while my squad provided security and our medics worked to stabilize the wounded. By the time reinforcements arrived to extract the convoy, Maria had eliminated 6 Taliban fighters and effectively ended an ambush that could have resulted in catastrophic American casualties. The after-action report credited effective small arms fire for the successful defense, with no mention of individual marksmanship or the distances involved. That's how it started, Maria concluded, meeting Colonel Mitchell's increasingly amazed stare. One emergency situation where someone had to make impossible shots to save American lives. What I didn't realize was that word spreads quickly in a combat zone when someone demonstrates capabilities that go far beyond their official job description. Within weeks, Maria found herself receiving unofficial requests from platoon leaders throughout the 173rd Airborne, requests for overwatch during patrol operations, requests for precision fire support during compound raids, requests to eliminate high-value targets that required surgical accuracy to avoid collateral damage. Each request added another small notch to the leather rifle case that now sat between them and Colonel Mitchell's office, a tangible record of deadly efficiency that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly 2 years. As Maria's story paused at this crucial juncture, Mitchell realized he was no longer looking at a soldier who had been dismissed from sniper school. He was looking at someone who had been conducting advanced sniper operations under combat conditions, while the military's official training programs struggled to adapt to changing realities. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, and whether the U.S. Army was ready to acknowledge what Maria Rodriguez had already proven in the mountains of Afghanistan. Colonel Mitchell's office had transformed into something resembling a war crimes tribunal, though neither participant fully grasped the gravity of what was unfolding. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the polished floor as Maria's revelations hung in the air like smoke from a distant battlefield. Mitchell found himself staring at the worn leather rifle case with a mixture of fascination and growing unease, his military mind struggling to process the implications of what he'd just heard. The silence stretched between them for nearly a full minute, 60 seconds that felt like an eternity, as Mitchell's thoughts raced through a labyrinth of military protocol, congressional oversight, and the uncomfortable reality that he might have just dismissed one of the most effective combat soldiers in recent Army history. His fingers drummed against the desk surface in an accelerating rhythm that betrayed his internal turmoil. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undertone that hadn't been present earlier. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about your capabilities and service record. Before we proceed with any reassignment, I believe it would be appropriate to conduct a more comprehensive review of your personnel file." Maria's dark eyes studied Mitchell's face with the same intensity she had once used to read wind patterns at impossible distances. She recognized the shift in his demeanor, the transition from bureaucratic dismissal to genuine military interest. It was the same look Captain Shun had worn when she first realized that her designated marksman possessed skills that transcended conventional infantry roles. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand," Maria replied, though she understood perfectly. Mitchell was fishing for more information, trying to determine whether her claims about Afghanistan were elaborate fiction or documented reality. The problem was that most of her reality had never been documented in any official capacity. "Walk me through your weapon system," Mitchell said, gesturing toward the rifle case that had captured his attention. "You mentioned modifications, custom, components. I'd like to understand exactly what we're dealing with here." The request hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maria realized this was a pivotal moment she could maintain. The fiction that she was simply an infantry soldier with above-average marksmanship skills, or she could reveal the full extent of what she had accomplished during 18 months of unofficial sniper operations. The choice would determine not just her immediate future, but potentially reshape how the Army viewed unconventional talent development in combat zones. "Sir, with your permission, I'd prefer to show you, rather." "Then describe it," Maria said, her hands moving toward the worn leather case with practiced precision. "Some things are better understood through demonstration than explanation." Mitchell nodded, his curiosity now completely overriding any concerns about protocol or scheduling. He pushed aside the dismissal paperwork that had seemed so important. An hour earlier, making space on his desk for whatever revelation was about to emerge from that mysterious case. Maria's fingers worked the brass, clasps with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. The case opened with a soft whisper of aged leather, revealing an interior lined with custom-cut foam that had been precisely shaped to cradle each component of what was clearly no ordinary military weapon. The main rifle lay in the center, a modified M4 platform that had been transformed through countless hours of meticulous craftsmanship into something that belonged more in a precision shooting competition than a standard infantry arsenal. "Jesus Christ," Mitchell breathed, his professional composure slipping as he took in the weapon's modifications. The standard barrel had been replaced with a match-grade precision tube that extended the rifle's effective range by hundreds of meters. The trigger mechanism showed clear signs of custom work modifications that would have required either extensive gunsmithing knowledge or access to specialized tools and expertise. Most striking was the scope system, a Vietnam-era Leupold Mark IV that had been expertly mounted and zeroed, its glass so perfectly clean it seemed to capture and reflect light with supernatural clarity. But it was the rifle's stock that made Mitchell's blood run cold. Along the dark wood, carved with surgical precision, were 47 small notches arranged in groups of 5. Each mark was identical in size and depth, created with the methodical care of someone who understood that these weren't decorative elements. They were a record of deadly efficiency that told a story no official report would ever capture. "Each mark represents a confirmed kill," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of memories that most people would never be asked to bear. "Taliban fighters eliminated at ranges between 400 and 1,200 meters, all verified by at least one witness, most of them documented through radio communications or after-action discussions with squad leaders." Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he leaned closer to examine the markings. His own combat experience included 2 deployments to Iraq, where he had served as a company commander during some of the heaviest fighting in Fallujah. He understood the psychological toll of taking human lives in combat, but 47 confirmed kills suggested a level of sustained precision shooting that bordered on the legendary. "Walk me through the first 5, Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to understand how this happened." Maria's fingers traced the first group of notches as her mind returned to those early days of her deployment when necessity had transformed her from a designated marksman into something far more deadly. "March 2019 through May 2019, she began, her voice taking on the clinical precision of someone recounting technical data rather than human deaths. 5 Taliban fighters, eliminated during 3 separate operations in Kandahar province. The first mark represented the machine gunner from the convoy ambush, the shot that had announced Maria's arrival as a precision marksman in a combat zone, where such skills meant the difference between American soldiers coming home alive or in flag-draped coffins. But the subsequent marks told a story of escalating responsibility in increasingly complex missions that had pushed her capabilities to their absolute limits. The second and third marks came during a patrol operation near Fob Shenk, Maria continued. Her eyes focused on something beyond Mitchell's office walls. Intelligence had identified a Taliban observation post that was reporting American patrol movements to IED emplacers. The position was located in a compound approximately 800 meters from our base, perimeter too far for effective engagement with standard infantry weapons, but close enough to pose a significant threat to our operations. Captain Chun had specifically requested Maria for the mission, marking the beginning of what would become an unofficial but increasingly frequent practice of utilizing her unique capabilities for surgical strikes that required absolute precision. The mission parameters were straightforward: eliminate the observation post without alerting other Taliban positions in the area, and do it with minimal ammunition expenditure to avoid revealing the location of friendly forces. I set up in an overwatch position at 0430 hours, Maria said, her hands unconsciously mimicking the movements of preparing for a precision shot. 2 targets, both armed, both clearly engaged in hostile surveillance activities. The range was 847 meters, with crosswinds gusting between 8 and 12 miles per hour. Temperature was 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity at 23% conditions that required precise calculation for bullet trajectory and wind compensation. Mitchell found himself mentally calculating the complexity of such shots. At nearly 900 meters, even experienced snipers would struggle with accuracy under field conditions. The fact that Maria had successfully engaged multiple targets at that range using a modified infantry rifle suggested skills that exceeded those of many formally trained precision marksmen. First shot eliminated the primary observer, Maria continued matter-of-factly. Second shot took down his partner before he could react or report our presence. Both targets dropped without any indication that other enemy positions had detected our activity. Mission accomplished with 0 friendly casualties and complete tactical surprise maintained. The 4th and 5th marks represented an escalation in both mission complexity and strategic importance. Taliban forces in Maria's sector had begun using female suicide bombers to target American checkpoints, a tactic that exploited cultural sensitivities about searching women and created deadly dilemmas for soldiers trying to balance force protection with respect for local customs. May 23, 2019, Maria said, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. Intelligence identified a female suicide bomber approaching checkpoint Charlie. The device she was carrying was large enough to kill or wound dozens of American and Afghan personnel, but the rules of engagement required positive identification of hostile intent before we could engage. The tactical situation had been a nightmare scenario. A potential suicide bomber approaching a crowded checkpoint filled with American soldiers and Afghan civilians, with seconds to make a decision that could save lives or create an international incident. Maria had been positioned on Overwatch specifically for such contingencies, but the shot she was asked to make pushed the boundaries of both technical difficulty and moral complexity. Range was 623 meters, Maria said, her hands unconsciously clenching as she recalled the pressure of that moment. The target was moving through a crowd of civilians, making precise shot placement critical to avoid collateral damage. I had approximately 15 seconds to acquire the target, calculate trajectory, and deliver a shot that would neutralize the threat without harming innocent bystanders. Mitchell realized he was holding his breath as Maria described a scenario that represented every commander's worst nightmare split-second decisions made under impossible pressure, with American lives hanging in the balance. Single shot, center mass, Maria concluded simply. The bomber dropped immediately, and the device detonated approximately 30 seconds later in an area that had been evacuated. Post-mission analysis confirmed that the explosive device contained enough C4 to have caused massive casualties. If it had reached the checkpoint. The fifth mark came 3 days later during a mission that would establish Maria's reputation throughout the 173rd Airborne as someone who could make impossible shots when conventional approaches failed. A high-value Taliban commander had been identified in a compound that was too heavily defended for a direct assault, but too important to ignore. May 26, 2019, Maria said, her voice now carrying the cadence of someone who had told this story before to intelligence debriefers and commanding officers. Target was a Taliban sub-commander responsible for coordinating IED attacks against American convoys. He was meeting with other insurgent leaders in a compound that our intelligence estimated contained between 15 and 20 armed fighters. The mission parameters had been unprecedented in Maria's experience. Eliminate a specific individual from a distance of over 1,000 meters while he was surrounded by other people, some of whom might be civilians, all without alerting the compounds. Defensive positions to the presence of American forces. I spent 6 hours in position, Maria said, waiting for a clear shot that would eliminate the target without risking collateral damage. The final shot was taken at 1,087 meters in variable wind conditions, through a window opening that provided approximately 8 inches of clearance. Mitchell's military experience allowed him to appreciate the technical difficulty of such a shot. At over a kilometer, even purpose-built sniper rifles struggled with accuracy, and the precision required to thread a bullet through a narrow opening while accounting for wind, humidity, and target movement was almost superhuman. Single shot, elimination, Maria concluded. Target down, no collateral damage, no detection of friendly positions. The compound remained unaware of American presence until Special Operations Forces conducted a follow-up raid 6 hours later. As Maria finished recounting the first 5 kills that had earned their place on her rifle stock, Colonel Mitchell found himself staring at a soldier who had been conducting precision sniper operations that exceeded the capabilities of most formally trained marksmen. The woman he had been prepared to dismiss as a failed sniper school candidate was revealing herself to be someone who had already proven her abilities under combat conditions that most elite soldiers would never face. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, and whether the U.S. Army was prepared to acknowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary soldiers emerge from the most unexpected places. The afternoon shadows in Colonel Mitchell's office had grown longer, creating an almost confessional atmosphere as Maria Rodriguez prepared to recount the mission that would forever define her as something beyond a conventional soldier. Her fingers traced the leather rifle case almost unconsciously, stopping at a particular cluster of notches that stood apart from the other 6 marks carved deeper than the rest, arranged in a pattern that suggested they had been added during a single terrible day. "Sir," Maria said, her voice carrying a weight that made Mitchell lean forward instinctively, "if you want to understand how I earned the right to be in sniper school, I need to tell you about March 15th, 2019, the day my platoon learned the difference between designated marksman support and what happens when someone trained by a Vietnam sniper decides that American soldiers aren't going to die on her watch." Mitchell's coffee had grown cold hours ago, but he found himself reaching for the cup anyway, needing something to occupy his hands as Maria's story transported him to a place where split-second decisions meant the difference between heroes and casualties. Outside Fort Benning, the routine sounds of military life continued, but inside this office, Time seemed suspended in the space between Maria's words and the terrible mathematics of warfare. Operation Iron Sweep, Maria began, using the official designation for what would become known throughout the 173rd Airborne as Rodriguez's Rampage, though that nickname would never appear in any official documentation. The mission was supposed to be routine. Establish overwatch positions for a convoy moving medical supplies to forward operating base Granite. Intelligence assessments indicated minimal threat presence in the Arghandab Valley corridor. Someone forgot to inform the Taliban about those assessments. The irony in her voice carried the bitter wisdom of soldiers who had learned that military intelligence was often neither military nor intelligent. Combat veterans understood that enemy forces had an annoying tendency to ignore American threat assessments and operate according to their own tactical priorities. My platoon consisted of 12 soldiers under Staff Sergeant Marcus Davies, good leader, combat experienced, someone who understood that textbook tactics don't always work when people are shooting back, Maria continued. I was positioned with the advance element, providing security for the convoy route, while our main force established blocking positions along the valley floor. It should have been a 6-hour operation with minimal contact. Mitchell had read enough after-action reports to recognize the setup for what military professionals euphemistically called a significant emotional event, the kind of engagement that transformed routine operations into legends whispered in NCO clubs and case studies analyzed in staff colleges. 0847 hours, Maria said, her voice taking on the precise cadence of someone recounting technical data rather than traumatic memories. First indication of enemy presence was a single sniper shot that wounded our point man, Specialist Johnson. Clean hit to the shoulder, obviously designed to wound rather than kill, classic Taliban tactic to draw rescue attempts into prepared kill zones. What followed was a textbook example of why the Taliban had survived decades of warfare against technologically superior forces. The initial sniper shot had been carefully positioned to funnel the American response into a valley floor where pre-positioned machine gun nests could achieve devastating crossfire effects. Within minutes, 12 American soldiers found themselves pinned down behind inadequate cover while enemy fire poured down from elevated positions that seemed impossible to assault. Johnson was bleeding badly, but every time someone tried to reach him, machine gun fire would drive them back, Maria continued. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in a horseshoe pattern around the valley floor, probably 8 to 10. Fighting positions, all mutually supporting, all with clear fields of fire over our location. They had us exactly where they wanted us. Staff Sergeant Davies had found himself facing a commander's nightmare. Wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention, enemy positions that couldn't be effectively engaged with standard infantry, weapons, and a tactical situation that was deteriorating rapidly. Standard procedure called for requesting air support or artillery, but both options would take precious time that Johnson might not have. That's when Davies looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Maria said, her eyes focusing on a point somewhere beyond Mitchell's desk. He said, Rodriguez, I know you're not officially a sniper, but right now I need someone who can make impossible shots from impossible distances. Can you help us? The question had transformed Maria from a designated marksman, providing supporting fire into the primary weapon system for a platoon level engagement against superior numbers in prepared positions. It was the moment when 18 months of unofficial precision shooting would be tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. I identified 6 distinct enemy positions, Maria said, her hands unconsciously mimicking the movements of range estimation and target acquisition. Machine gun nest at 680 meters on the eastern ridge, sniper position at 720 meters directly north, mortar team at approximately 800 meters northwest, and 3 additional rifle positions between 450 and 550 meters. All elevated, all with excellent cover and concealment, all effectively beyond the range of our standard weapons. Mitchell's military experience allowed him to visualize the tactical situation. American soldiers trapped in low ground while enemy fighters controlled the high ground with overlapping fields of fire. It was every infantry officer's worst nightmare, the kind of scenario that turned routine operations into casualty reports and memorial services. I moved to an overwatch position, approximately 300 meters upslope from our main element, Maria continued. It wasn't ideal, exposed to counterfire, limited cover, no spotter support, but it provided clear lines of sight to the enemy positions and sufficient elevation to negate some of their terrain advantages. What happened next would be studied and debated in military circles for years afterward, though most of the analysis would remain classified due to the unconventional nature of Maria's employment and the sensitivity surrounding women in combat roles. In the span of 18 minutes, a single soldier with a modified infantry rifle would systematically dismantle a Taliban ambush that had been months in the planning. First target was the machine gun position on the eastern ridge, Maria said, her voice becoming even more clinical as she described actions that had saved American lives. Range 687 meters, wind from the southwest at approximately 12 miles per hour, temperature 89 degrees Fahrenheit. The gunner was partially concealed behind a rock formation, presenting a target profile of maybe 8 inches. The shot that followed demonstrated the deadly precision that Maria's father had spent years developing during their weekend trips to the Mojave Desert. One bullet, fired across nearly 700 meters of hostile terrain, found its mark with surgical accuracy. Machine gunner down with the first shot, Maria reported matter-of-factly. His assistant gunner attempted to take over the weapon, but he exposed himself in the process. Second shot eliminated him at 694 meters before he could engage our position. The Taliban fighters had expected their elevated positions and prepared defenses to provide sanctuary from American retaliation. They had not expected to face someone capable of delivering precision fire at ranges that exceeded their understanding of infantry capabilities. The sniper position was next, Maria continued. This target was more challenging, concealed in a cave opening with only occasional exposure when he moved to acquire targets. I had to wait approximately 4 minutes for a clear shot opportunity. The patience required for precision shooting under combat conditions was something that couldn't be taught in conventional military training. It required the mental discipline to remain motionless while friendly forces were under fire, to wait for the perfect moment when tactical necessity aligned with technical opportunity. Shot 3 eliminated the enemy sniper at 723 meters, Maria sighed. The bullet entered the cave opening during the brief moment when he exposed himself to engage Specialist Johnson's position. After that shot, the remaining Taliban positions seemed to realize they were facing something unexpected. The psychological impact of watching their most protected fighters eliminated by invisible precision fire had immediate effects on Taliban. Tactical cohesion. Enemy fighters who had been conducting a coordinated ambush suddenly found themselves questioning the safety of positions they had considered impregnable. The mortar team presented the most complex target, Maria continued. 3 individuals working together at approximately 810 meters, partially concealed behind a stone wall. They were preparing to engage our position with indirect fire. If they had succeeded, our entire element would have been wiped out. The mathematics of engaging multiple targets at extended range while under enemy fire pushed Maria's capabilities to their absolute limits. Each shot required instant recalculation of range, wind compensation, and target movement, all while maintaining the mental focus necessary for precision marksmanship. Shot 4 eliminated the mortar team leader at 806 meters, Maria said. Shot 5 took down the assistant gunner at 813 meters, as he attempted to complete the firing solution. The third team member abandoned the position after watching his colleagues drop smart tactical decision on his part. By this point in the engagement, Taliban fighters throughout the valley had begun to understand that their carefully planned ambush was being systematically dismantled by a single American shooter whose capabilities exceeded anything in their operational experience. The remaining rifle positions began repositioning, attempting to locate and engage Maria's overwatch position. The final shot was the most difficult, Maria said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. The remaining Taliban fighter was attempting to flank our position using a covered approach through a ravine system. Range was only 456 meters, but he was moving fast through heavy vegetation, presenting intermittent target opportunities lasting no more than 2 or 3 seconds. The shot that followed would become the subject of intense analysis by military marksmanship experts who struggled to understand how a single soldier had achieved what should have required a trained sniper team with extensive support equipment. Shot. 6 eliminated the flanking fighter at 461 meters while he was moving through underbrush, Maria concluded. Total engagement time, 18 minutes, 47 seconds. 6 enemy fighters eliminated, 0 friendly casualties beyond Specialist Johnson's initial wound. Taliban ambush neutralized with minimal ammunition expenditure. The silence that followed Maria's recounting was profound. Colonel Mitchell found himself staring at a woman who had just described conducting counter-sniper operations that exceeded the performance standards of formally trained precision marksmen. The tactical situation she had resolved would have challenged experienced sniper teams operating with spotters, advanced optics, and extensive support systems. What happened after the engagement? Mitchell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Nothing, Maria replied with bitter irony. The after-action report credited effective small arms fire for the successful defense. My role was mentioned in passing as designated marksman support. No specific mention of individual marksmanship, no documentation of the ranges involved, no recognition that a single soldier had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of American lives. Mitchell realized he was looking at a soldier whose combat achievements had been systematically minimized and underreported, hidden behind military bureaucracy's reluctance to acknowledge that exceptional performance sometimes emerged from unexpected sources. The woman he had dismissed from sniper school had already proven her capabilities under conditions that most elite soldiers would never face. The question now was whether the U.S. Army was prepared to acknowledge what Maria Rodriguez had accomplished in the mountains of Afghanistan, and whether institutional prejudices were more important than battlefield performance. The Georgia evening had settled over Fort Benning like a heavy blanket, transforming Colonel Mitchell's office into an island of fluorescent light in the gathering darkness. Nearly 6 hours had passed since Maria Rodriguez was supposed to have been dismissed and reassigned to a logistics battalion, but the leather rifle case still sat open on his desk like a piece of evidence in a trial that was reshaping everything he thought he knew about military personnel management and the hidden capabilities that existed within the Army's ranks. Mitchell stared at the phone on his desk as if it were an explosive device. The black plastic instrument represented a choice that could either validate the most extraordinary story he'd ever heard from a subordinate, or expose him as a gullible commander who had been manipulated by an elaborate fabrication. But the tactical details Maria had provided, the precision of her recollections, and the physical evidence of her modified weapon system all suggested that he was looking at something unprecedented in his 23 years of military service. Sergeant Rodriguez, Mitchell said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could affect both their careers. I'm going to make some phone calls to verify your claims. I want you to understand that if any part of your story proves to be false or exaggerated, you'll face charges for making false official statements. Are you prepared to stand by everything you've told me? Maria met his gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. Yes, sir. Every word. Every shot. Every life saved. The first call went to the personnel office at Bagram Airfield, where deployment records were maintained for all soldiers who had served in Afghanistan during the time frame Maria had specified. Mitchell identified himself and requested verification of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's service record, deployment dates, and unit assignments. The response came within minutes. Maria Elena Rodriguez, 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, 2 deployments between February 2019 and September 2020. Exemplary service record, multiple commendations for valor and marksmanship, but official records only told part of the story. Mitchell needed to speak with the officers and NCOs who had actually served alongside Maria, who had witnessed her performance under combat conditions, who could either confirm or contradict the extraordinary claims she had made about her unofficial role as a precision marksman. The second call reached Captain Sarah Chun at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where she was serving as a company commander in the 101st Airborne Division. Mitchell identified himself and explained that he was conducting a personnel review of one of her former soldiers. Chun's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Rodriguez? Chun's voice crackled through the secure phone line with obvious excitement. Sir, are you finally going to give that woman the recognition she deserves? Because I've been writing letters to every staff officer. I know for the past 2 years, trying to get someone to pay attention to what she accomplished during our deployment. Mitchell felt his pulse quicken as Chun began to recount stories that corroborated and expanded upon everything Maria had told him. The convoy ambush, the Taliban observation post, the suicide bomber incident, all verified by an officer whose credibility was beyond question. Sir, I need you to understand something, Chun continued, her voice taking on the intensity of someone who had been waiting years to tell this story to someone with the authority to act on it. Rodriguez saved more American lives during our deployment than any other single soldier I commanded. She was conducting precision shooting operations that should have required a trained sniper team, and she was doing it with equipment she built herself because the Army couldn't recognize what we actually needed in the field. The conversation with Chun lasted nearly 40 minutes, during which Mitchell received a masterclass in adaptive leadership and unconventional problem-solving under combat conditions. Chun described how she had gradually expanded Maria's role from designated marksman to unofficial sniper, how she had bent regulations to provide the equipment and positioning necessary for Maria to maximize her capabilities, and how she had struggled to document Maria's achievements within a military bureaucracy that wasn't equipped to recognize excellence when it emerged from unexpected sources. The worst part, Shin concluded, is that everything Rodriguez accomplished was credited to collective unit performance rather than individual excellence. The Army got the benefit of her capabilities while denying her the recognition that could have led to proper training and utilization of her talents. The third call reached Staff Sergeant Marcus Davies at Fort Lewis, Washington, where he was serving as a drill instructor for new recruits. Davies had been Maria's squad leader during the Valley engagement that had resulted in 6 confirmed kills in 18 minutes. His response to Mitchell's inquiry was even more emphatic than Chun's had been. Sir, with all due respect, Davies said, his voice carrying the blunt honesty of a career NCO who had seen too much combat to waste time on diplomatic niceties. Rodriguez is the finest marksman I've ever served with, and I've been in the Army for 16 years. What she did in that valley wasn't just exceptional shooting. It was the kind of performance that legends are built on. Davies proceeded to provide tactical details that matched Maria's account with startling precision. The ranges involved, the weather conditions, the sequence of shots, and the psychological impact on both American and Taliban forces. But he also provided context that Maria had omitted from her own narrative, the broader implications of her performance, and the way it had influenced subsequent operations throughout their deployment. After word spread about what Rodriguez could do, Davies explained, every platoon leader in the battalion started requesting her for high-risk operations. She became our go-to solution for situations where standard infantry tactics weren't sufficient. The problem was that she was still officially classified as a designated marksman, which meant she couldn't receive the support, equipment, or recognition that someone with her capabilities deserved. The fourth call connected Mitchell with Major James Thompson, who had served as the battalion operations officer during Maria's deployment. Thompson's perspective provided the strategic overview that put Maria's individual achievements into broader military context. "Colonel," Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had wrestled with difficult decisions under impossible circumstances, "Rodriguez represented everything that's both right and wrong with how the Army manages exceptional talent. She was clearly capable of performing at a level that exceeded our formal training programs. But our personnel systems weren't flexible enough to accommodate someone who developed those capabilities through non-traditional means." Thompson described how Maria's unofficial sniper operations had influenced enemy behavior throughout their area of operations. Taliban forces had begun avoiding areas where American patrols were known to operate, changing their tactics to account for the presence of what they believed was a highly trained sniper team. The psychological impact of her precision shooting had extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. The intelligence reports we received during the latter part of our deployment indicated that Taliban fighters were genuinely afraid of engaging American forces in our sector. Thompson continued, they had developed an almost mythical fear of what they called the Ghost, a sniper who could eliminate targets at impossible distances without being detected. They never realized it was a single soldier operating with modified equipment and minimal support. The fifth call reached Sergeant First Class Michael Hayes, who had served as the senior marksmanship instructor for the 173rd Airborne during Maria's deployment. Hayes had been responsible for maintaining weapons and training soldiers in advanced shooting techniques. His assessment of Maria's capabilities was perhaps the most technically detailed of all the conversations Mitchell had conducted. "Sir," Hayes began, "I need to tell you something that's been bothering me for 2 years. Rodriguez came to me during her deployment with a rifle that she had modified using techniques I'd never seen before. The precision work she had done on that weapon was at the level of a master gunsmith, and she had accomplished it under field conditions using improvised tools and spare parts." Hayes described how Maria had approached him with questions about advanced ballistics calculations, environmental factors that affected long-range shooting, and modifications that could improve accuracy at extended ranges. What impressed him most was not just her technical knowledge, but her understanding of the theoretical principles underlying precision marksmanship. "She understood ballistics at a level that most of my formal students never reached," Hayes continued. "But more than that, she had an intuitive grasp of shooting fundamentals that you can't teach, the kind of natural ability that appears maybe once in a generation." The sixth and final call went to Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Morrison, who had commanded the 173rd Airborne Brigade's intelligence section during Maria's deployment. Morrison's perspective provided insight into the broader implications of Maria's performance and the missed opportunities that her unofficial status had created. "Colonel Mitchell," Morrison said, "I've been tracking Rodriguez's activities for 2 years because what she accomplished represents a fundamental failure in how the Army identifies and develops exceptional talent. She was conducting precision shooting operations that provided critical intelligence value, but because her role was unofficial, we couldn't properly analyze or replicate her methods." Morrison explained how Maria's precision eliminations had disrupted Taliban command and control networks in ways that formal intelligence operations had struggled to achieve. Each high-value target that Maria had eliminated represented months of intelligence gathering and analysis. But the tactical impact of her actions had been far greater than the strategic value of capturing those individuals through conventional means. The tragedy, Morrison concluded, is that we had a soldier capable of performing at the level of our most elite units, but our personnel systems couldn't recognize or properly utilize her capabilities. She should have been fast-tracked into advanced training programs years ago. As Mitchell concluded his final phone call, he found himself staring at Maria Rodriguez with a mixture of amazement and professional embarrassment. 6 different officers and NCOs had independently confirmed and expanded upon her claims, providing tactical details and strategic context that painted a picture of exceptional performance that had been systematically ignored by the Army's formal recognition systems. The woman sitting across from his desk wasn't just a failed sniper school candidate. She was a soldier whose combat achievements exceeded those of most formally trained precision marksmen. She had been conducting advanced sniper operations under conditions that would challenge elite units, and she had done it without official recognition, proper equipment, or institutional support. The phone calls had revealed something even more disturbing than Maria's individual story. They had exposed a systemic failure in how the Army identified, developed, and utilized exceptional talent. How many other soldiers possessed capabilities that were being overlooked because they didn't fit traditional career progression models? How many opportunities for tactical innovation were being missed because the military's bureaucratic structures couldn't adapt to unconventional excellence? Sergeant Rodriguez, Mitchell said finally, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been present when their conversation began hours earlier. I owe you an apology. More than that, the United States Army owes you an apology. What you accomplished during your deployments represents exactly the kind of precision marksmanship capabilities that our sniper school is supposed to develop. The fact that you achieved this level of performance without formal training suggests that we've been approaching talent development in fundamentally flawed ways. Maria's response was characteristically understated. Sir, I just did what was necessary to bring American soldiers home alive. But Mitchell now understood that what Maria considered necessary represented a level of tactical excellence that the Army's most elite programs struggled to produce. The question now was what to do with this knowledge, and whether institutional prejudices could be overcome by undeniable battlefield performance. The leather rifle case still sat open on his desk, its 47 notches bearing silent testimony to capabilities that had been hidden in plain sight for 2 years. Tomorrow, Mitchell would have to decide whether to perpetuate a system that had failed to recognize exceptional talent, or take actions that could reshape how the Army approached precision marksmanship training and gender integration in elite military programs. The fort, Benning night, had settled into that peculiar stillness that exists only on military installations after duty hours, a quiet broken intermittently by the distant sounds of guard rotations and the occasional rumble of late-night training exercises. Colonel Mitchell's office had become a war room of sorts, littered with coffee cups, scattered personnel files, and the omnipresent leather rifle case that had transformed a routine dismissal into the most significant decision of his military. Career. Mitchell stood at his window, staring out at the darkened parade grounds where generations of soldiers had learned the fundamentals of infantry warfare. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged considerably in the past 8 hours. His uniform wrinkled, his graying hair disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it as he grappled with implications that extended far beyond a single personnel decision. Behind him, Maria Rodriguez sat in patient silence, her posture still military precise, despite the exhaustion that must have been overwhelming after recounting the most traumatic and triumphant moments of her combat service. She understood that Mitchell was wrestling with something larger than her individual case. He was confronting the fundamental question of whether the United States Army was capable of adapting to realities that challenged its most deeply held assumptions about warfare, leadership, and the integration of women into elite combat roles. The phone on Mitchell's desk had been ringing intermittently for the past hour. Word was spreading through the military bureaucracy that something unusual was happening at Fort Benning's sniper school. Personnel officers were calling to inquire about delayed paperwork. Training coordinators wanted to know why a dismissed student was still on the installation. Most disturbing, Mitchell had received 2 calls from congressional liaison officers who had somehow learned that a situation involving women in combat training was developing at his facility. "Colonel," Maria said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly 10 minutes, "I want you to know that I understand the position this puts you in. If it would be easier to proceed with my original reassignment, I'm prepared to accept that decision." Mitchell turned from the window, studying the woman who had just offered to sacrifice her own interests to protect his career. It was exactly the kind of selfless professionalism that the Army claimed to value above all else. Yet the institution seemed incapable of recognizing it when it came packaged in ways that challenged traditional expectations. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Mitchell replied, his voice heavy with the weight of impending decision. "What you're offering represents everything that's wrong with how we've handled your case. You're prepared to accept injustice to spare the institution embarrassment. But maybe it's time for this institution to experience some embarrassment if it leads to necessary changes." The truth was that Mitchell faced a choice between career survival and moral courage, a decision that would define not only his own legacy, but potentially influence the trajectory of military integration policies for years to come. Reinstating Maria would require him to acknowledge that the sniper school's admission standards and evaluation criteria were fundamentally flawed. It would mean confronting the male students who had complained about her presence and telling them that their objections were less important than her demonstrated capabilities. Most dangerously, it would attract attention from military and political leaders who preferred that such issues be resolved quietly rather than becoming public examples of institutional change. The phone rang again, displaying a number that made Mitchell's stomach clench with recognition. General Patricia Morrison, commanding officer of the Army's Special Operations Command, and one of the most powerful women in the contemporary military. Morrison's interest in this case could either provide crucial support for making the right decision or create pressure to maintain the status quo depending on her perspective and political calculations. "Colonel Mitchell," General Morrison's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "I understand you're dealing with a situation involving Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I've received some interesting phone calls in the past few hours from officers who served with her in Afghanistan. Perhaps we should discuss this matter." Mitchell felt his career hanging in the balance as he realized that word of Maria's story had reached the highest levels of military leadership. Morrison's reputation as a progressive officer who advocated for merit-based advancement regardless of gender provided some hope. But her position also meant that any decision he made would be scrutinized by officials who could end his military service with a single negative evaluation. "General," Mitchell replied carefully, "I'm currently conducting a comprehensive review of Sergeant Rodriguez's qualifications and service record. Some information has come to light that suggests our initial assessment may have been incomplete." "Colonel," Morrison said with the kind of directness that had made her legendary among junior officers, "let me save you some time. I've been tracking Rodriguez's performance for 2 years, because what she accomplished in Afghanistan represents exactly the kind of adaptive leadership and technical innovation that Special Operations Command values. The question isn't whether she's qualified for sniper training. The question is whether the Army is capable of recognizing exceptional talent when it challenges our preconceptions. The conversation that followed would reshape Mitchell's understanding of how military leadership functioned at the highest levels. Morrison explained that she had been watching the integration of women into combat roles with particular attention to cases where exceptional performance was being overlooked or minimized due to institutional biases. Maria's case represented everything that was both promising and problematic about current military policies. The Pentagon is under enormous pressure to demonstrate that gender integration is working, Morrison continued. But we're also facing resistance from traditionalist elements who are looking for any excuse to claim that women aren't capable of performing in elite units. Rodriguez's case could be a powerful demonstration of female combat effectiveness, or it could become a political liability if it's handled incorrectly. Mitchell began to understand that his decision about Maria would reverberate far beyond Fort Benning. Success would provide ammunition for advocates of expanded roles for women in special operations. Failure would be seized upon by critics who argued that integration was lowering military standards. There was no neutral ground. Whatever he decided would be interpreted as a statement about the Army's commitment to merit-based advancement versus traditional gender roles. General, Mitchell said, I need to ask you directly. Are you ordering me to reinstate Sergeant Rodriguez, or are you providing guidance that allows me to make this decision based on military merit? Colonel, Morrison replied after a pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity. I'm telling you that the Army needs leaders who are capable of recognizing excellence regardless of how it's packaged. Rodriguez's combat record speaks for itself. The question is whether you're prepared to stand behind that record even if it creates controversy. As Mitchell ended the call with General Morrison, he found himself facing the kind of decision that defined military careers and personal character. The safe choice was to proceed with Maria's original dismissal, perhaps with a recommendation for alternative training that would satisfy bureaucratic requirements while avoiding institutional confrontation. But the right choice, the choice that honored Maria's service and acknowledged the Army's obligation to maximize the capabilities of exceptional soldiers required, accepting risk and potential career damage. Maria had remained silent during his phone conversation, but her expression suggested that she understood the political dimensions of what was unfolding. She had offered him an easy exit, and her willingness to accept injustice in order to protect his position only emphasized the moral stakes involved. Sergeant Rodriguez, Mitchell said, turning to face her directly, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly, regardless of what you think I want to hear. If I reinstate you in sniper school, are you prepared to face the scrutiny, pressure, and potential hostility that will inevitably follow? Because I can guarantee that your presence will be controversial, and there will be people actively hoping for you to fail. Maria's response was immediate and unwavering. Sir, I've been facing scrutiny, pressure, and hostility my entire military career. The difference is that this time, I'll be facing it while doing something I'm actually trained for, rather than trying to prove myself in roles where I'm not allowed to demonstrate my capabilities. Her answer crystallized something that had been forming in Mitchell's mind throughout their conversation. The Army had spent years debating whether women could perform in elite combat roles while simultaneously preventing them from accessing the training and opportunities necessary to develop those capabilities. Maria represented proof that the debate itself was based on false premises. She had already demonstrated elite-level performance under combat conditions that exceeded anything the sniper school could simulate. Mitchell walked to his desk and picked up the dismissal paperwork that had been prepared, that morning, documents that now seemed like artifacts from a different era. With deliberate precision, he tore the papers in half and dropped them into his wastebasket. Sergeant Rodriguez, he said formally, I'm hereby rescinding your dismissal from the U.S. Army Sniper School. You will report to the chief instructor tomorrow morning for reassignment to the current training class. Furthermore, I'm recommending that you be considered for an accelerated program that recognizes your demonstrated proficiency in precision marksmanship. The decision was made, but Mitchell understood that implementation would be far more complex than simply signing new orders. He would need to address the male students who had complained about Maria's presence, confront instructors who might, resist her reinstatement, and prepare for the political firestorm that would inevitably follow when word of this decision reached congressional oversight committees and military advocacy groups. "Sir," Maria said, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and determination, "I want you to know that I understand the risk you're taking. I won't let you down." "Sergeant," Mitchell replied, "you've already proven yourself under conditions that most of us will never face. The question isn't whether you'll let me down. The question is whether the Army is finally ready to live up to its stated commitment to merit-based advancement." As Maria gathered her equipment and prepared to leave his office, Mitchell realized that he had just made a decision that would define the remainder of his military career. Tomorrow would bring challenges that he couldn't fully anticipate, but tonight he could sleep knowing that he had chosen justice over convenience, merit over politics, and the future over the past. The leather rifle case with its 47 notches disappeared into the Georgia night, but its impact on the U.S. Army Sniper School would be felt for generations to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Benning's precision rifle range as an unprecedented gathering assembled to witness what would either vindicate Colonel Mitchell's controversial decision or destroy both his career and Maria Rodriguez's future in the Army. Word of Maria's reinstatement had spread through the sniper school like wildfire, creating a polarized atmosphere that threatened to tear the program apart before the first shot was fired. Sergeant Major William Hayes, the school's senior instructor and a 20-year veteran with 3 combat deployments, stood near the firing line with his arms crossed and his weathered face set in an expression of barely concealed skepticism. Behind him, 12 male students who had been in Maria's original class whispered among themselves with the nervous energy of people who knew their complaints had initiated a chain of events they could no longer control. The morning air carried their hushed conversations fragments of doubt, resentment, and curiosity about whether the woman they had dismissed as a distraction could actually deliver on the extraordinary claims that had reached their ears. "Gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell addressed the assembled group, his voice carrying the weight of authority backed by career-defining conviction. "We're here this morning to conduct what I'm calling a practical evaluation of precision marksmanship capabilities. Sergeant Rodriguez has agreed to demonstrate her skills under conditions that will either validate or contradict claims about her combat performance in Afghanistan." The range itself had been configured to present challenges that would test every aspect of advanced marksmanship. Targets positioned at 400, 600, 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters, with varying elevations that required complex ballistic calculations. Weather conditions were deliberately challenging crosswinds, gusting between 12 and 18 miles per hour, temperature fluctuating as morning clouds intermittently blocked the sun, and humidity levels that would affect bullet trajectory in ways that required instant mental calculations. Maria stood at the equipment table, methodically assembling her modified rifle with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this ritual under combat conditions where mechanical failure meant death. Her movements were economic, purposeful, betraying no nervousness despite the knowledge that her entire future hung in the balance of the next hour's performance. She was aware that every eye was upon her, that every shot would be scrutinized by people hoping either for her triumph or her failure. "Range is hot," Sergeant Major Hayes announced with the crisp professionalism of someone who had overseen thousands of shooting demonstrations. "Shooter, you may commence when ready." The 400-meter target appeared almost insultingly close to someone who had regularly engaged enemies at twice that distance. But Maria understood that this first shot was about more than accuracy. It was about establishing credibility with an audience that had been conditioned to doubt her capabilities. She settled into her shooting position, rifle stock pressed firmly against her shoulder, breathing controlled and deliberate as she acquired the target through her scope. The shot broke with mechanical precision, the suppressed crack of the rifle, followed by the distinctive metallic ping of a bullet striking steel at distance. Through their spotting scopes, the observers could see that Maria's bullet had found the exact center of the target, creating a hole that would have passed through a playing card held vertically. "Dead center," called out Instructor Staff Sergeant Martinez, his voice carrying a note of surprise despite his attempt at professional neutrality. Perfect shot. But it was the 600-meter target that began to separate Maria's performance from conventional expectations. The distance required compensation for bullet drop, wind drift, and the subtle effects of changing atmospheric conditions. Most importantly, it demanded the kind of mental discipline that distinguished precision marksmen from soldiers who happened to be good shots. Maria's preparation for the second shot lasted nearly 3 minutes' time spent reading wind indicators, calculating environmental factors, and achieving the meditative state of absolute focus that her father had taught her during those weekend sessions in the Mojave Desert. When she finally fired, the bullet's impact was instantaneous and devastating. Another perfect center hit that drew audible gasps from several observers. "Jesus," whispered one of the male students, his voice carrying grudging admiration mixed with disbelief. "How is she making this look so easy?" The 800-meter shot elevated the demonstration into territory that challenged even experienced snipers. At that distance, a bullet required nearly a full second to reach its target, time during which wind conditions could change, atmospheric pressure could fluctuate, and minor errors in calculation could result in complete misses. The target itself appeared as little more than a distant glint of metal, requiring optical precision and mathematical accuracy that pushed the boundaries of human capability. Maria's approach to the 800-meter shot revealed the depth of her technical knowledge and combat experience. She spent nearly 5 minutes analyzing wind patterns, testing different cheek welds on her rifle stock, and making minute adjustments to her scope settings based on calculations that she performed with the fluidity of someone who had made such computations under enemy fire. When the shot came, it seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before finding its mark with the same surgical precision that had characterized her previous efforts. The distant target shuddered as 168-grain match ammunition struck exactly where she had intended, creating a grouping that defied statistical probability. "That's impossible," Sergeant Major Hayes muttered, his professional skepticism cracking as he witnessed shooting that exceeded the performance capabilities of most formally trained snipers. Nobody makes 3 consecutive perfect shots at those distances. But Maria was far from finished. The 1,000-meter target represented a threshold that separated good marksmen from exceptional ones, a distance where minor imperfections in technique, equipment, or environmental calculation resulted in dramatic failures. The mathematics of ballistics became exponentially more complex, requiring knowledge of advanced physics that most soldiers never encountered in their formal training. "Wind is shifting," Maria announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone who had learned to treat shooting as applied science rather than intuitive art. Gusting from southwest to west-southwest, velocity increasing to approximately 15 miles per hour at mid-range, dropping to 12 at the target. Her preparation for the 1,000-meter shot revealed capabilities that astonished even veteran instructors. Maria produced a small notebook filled with ballistic tables that she had calculated herself, referencing data that accounted for everything from the Coriolis effect to the specific ballistic coefficient of her chosen ammunition. Her shooting position was adjusted with microscopic precision, every point of contact between her body and the rifle optimized for maximum stability. The shot that followed defied rational explanation. At 1,000 meters, under challenging wind conditions, using a rifle that had been assembled from modified infantry components, Maria placed her bullet with the precision of a laboratory instrument. The target rang with metallic finality, announcing another perfect hit that left observers struggling to process what they had witnessed. "This isn't possible," one of the male students said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Nobody shoots like this. There has to be some kind of trick." The accusation hung in the air, like an accusation of witchcraft, reflecting the psychological difficulty of accepting that their preconceptions about gender, training, and military capability had been systematically demolished by observable reality. Maria's response was to chamber another round and acquire the 1,200-meter target, distance that approached the theoretical limits of her rifle system, and represented a challenge that would test every skill she had developed over years of combat operations. At 1,200 meters, the target appeared as little more than a theoretical concept through her scope. The bullet would require nearly 2 seconds to travel the distance, during which atmospheric conditions could change dramatically. Wind calculations became three-dimensional problems, involving thermal gradients and pressure differentials that most snipers never learned to assess. The margin for error approached zero. A few inches of miscalculation would result in a complete miss that would validate every doubt about her capabilities. Maria's preparation for the final shot lasted nearly 10 minutes, during which she demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that impressed even the most skeptical observers. She used a handheld weather meter to measure precise atmospheric conditions, consulted multiple reference sources for ballistic data, and made rifle adjustments that reflected an understanding of mechanical precision that exceeded formal training standards. When she finally settled into her final shooting position, the range fell into absolute silence. Even the wind seemed to pause as Maria controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and applied pressure to a trigger that had been adjusted to break at exactly 2 pounds of force. The shot seemed to echo across the range for an eternity before the distant metallic ring announced another perfect hit. Through their spotting scopes, the observers could see that Maria had placed 5 consecutive shots into the exact center of targets spanning 800 meters of distance. Under challenging environmental conditions, using equipment that she had modified herself. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Sergeant Major Hayes stood motionless, his spotting scope still pressed to his eye, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The male students who had complained about Maria's presence were equally speechless, their objections rendered meaningless by a demonstration of capability that exceeded anything they had ever witnessed. "I've been training snipers for 15 years, Hayes finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I've never seen shooting like that. Not from anyone. Not under any conditions." Colonel Mitchell felt a mixture of vindication and professional pride as he realized that his controversial decision had been validated by performance that transcended any reasonable doubt. Maria Rodriguez had just demonstrated that she possessed capabilities that justified not only her reinstatement in sniper school, but potentially her immediate advancement to instructor status. The demonstration had accomplished something that no amount of political maneuvering or bureaucratic pressure could have achieved. It had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that exceptional military capability could emerge from unexpected sources, and that institutional prejudices were less important than battlefield performance. As Maria began to clean her rifle with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout her shooting, Colonel Mitchell realized that this morning had changed more than just her individual career prospects. It had challenged fundamental assumptions about military training, gender integration, and the identification of exceptional talent within the Army's ranks. The question now was whether the institution would have the courage to embrace the implications of what they had just witnessed. 3 months after the demonstration that shattered every preconception about precision marksmanship at Fort Benning, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood before a classroom of the most diverse group of sniper candidates in U.S. Army history. 12 students, 7 men and 5 women sat at attention as the morning sun streamed through windows that overlooked the same rifle range where Maria had silenced her critics with shooting that military analysts were still struggling to quantify and understand. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours of Maria's demonstration, cell phone videos recorded by stunned observers had reached Pentagon officials whose response was immediate and decisive. Secretary of Defense Patricia Morrison herself had called Colonel Mitchell to express her personal interest in fast-tracking the integration of exceptional talent, regardless of traditional career progression models. The phrase would become a cornerstone of new military personnel policies that were already being implemented across all service branches. But the path from that morning, demonstration to Maria's current position as the Army's youngest sniper instructor, had been anything but smooth. The media attention that followed had transformed her from an unknown soldier into a reluctant symbol of military gender integration, a role that brought scrutiny, controversy, and political pressure that extended far beyond Fort Benning's gates. Today we're going to discuss something that textbooks don't cover, Maria announced to her students, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through performance rather than rank. The difference between shooting at targets and shooting to save lives. The difference between knowing ballistics tables and understanding that every calculation you make in combat represents the difference between your teammates going home alive or in flag-draped coffins. The students before her represented a new generation of military precision marksmen, selected through updated criteria that emphasized demonstrated capability over traditional background requirements. 2 of the women had been infantry soldiers whose exceptional marksmanship had been identified through combat deployments. 3 of the men were former Marines who had requested Army sniper training after hearing about the innovative instruction methods being developed at Fort Benning. All of them understood that they were participating in something historically significant. Maria's teaching methodology had revolutionized sniper instruction in ways that challenged decades of established doctrine, rather than beginning with theoretical ballistics and gradually progressing to practical application. She started each course with combat scenarios that required students to make life-or-death decisions under pressure. Equipment modification workshops taught students to optimize their weapons using field-expedient techniques. Most controversially, she required every student to understand the psychological and moral complexities of precision killing in ways that previous instruction had avoided. Instructor Rodriguez asked Private First Class Jennifer Chun, one of the female students whose infantry deployment to Syria had revealed exceptional long-range shooting abilities. The manual says that sniper teams should consist of a shooter and a spotter working together. But your combat record shows mostly solo operations. How do we reconcile theory with battlefield reality? The question touched on one of the most significant changes that Maria's experience had brought to Army doctrine. Traditional sniper employment emphasized 2-person teams with clearly defined roles and extensive support infrastructure. But Maria's combat record had demonstrated that properly trained individuals could achieve exceptional results operating independently when tactical situations required adaptive employment. Private Chun, Maria replied, the manual was written by people who had never faced situations where American lives depended on shots that nobody else could make. In Afghanistan, I operated solo because that's what the tactical situation required. But that doesn't mean solo operation is preferable. It means that exceptional snipers must be capable of adapting to whatever the mission demands. The conversation that followed illustrated how Maria's teaching had evolved beyond technical instruction to include strategic thinking about the role of precision marksmen in contemporary warfare. Students learned not just how to make difficult shots, but when those shots were tactically appropriate, how to coordinate with conventional forces, and how to operate in environments where enemy forces had adapted their tactics to counter sniper threats. Outside the classroom, Maria's impact on military culture had extended far beyond sniper training. The video of her demonstration had been viewed millions of times on social media platforms, generating conversations about women in combat that reached far beyond military circles. Congressional representatives had cited her story during debates about defense spending and gender integration policies. Most importantly, her success had encouraged other female soldiers to pursue specialized training that had previously seemed inaccessible. But fame had brought challenges that Maria struggled to navigate. Media requests arrived daily, asking her to comment on everything from military policy to feminist politics. Book publishers offered substantial advances for her memoir. Documentary filmmakers wanted to chronicle her transformation from dismissed student to groundbreaking instructor. Maria declined most opportunities, preferring to focus on the mission that had always driven her, training soldiers to bring their teammates home alive. The hardest part, Maria had confided to Colonel Mitchell during one of their regular mentoring sessions, isn't the attention or the politics. It's knowing that every decision I make reflects on every woman who might want to follow this path. If I fail, it becomes evidence that women can't handle elite military roles. If I succeed, it gets attributed to exceptional circumstances rather than systematic capability development. Mitchell's own career had been transformed by his decision to support Maria's reinstatement. His promotion to brigadier general had been accompanied by assignment to lead a Pentagon task force on innovative talent development in special operations. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that supporting a dismissed student had led to his most prestigious assignment. While Maria's exceptional combat record had required public vindication before it received official recognition, the changes at Fort Benning extended beyond Maria's classroom. The sniper school's admission standards had been revised to emphasize demonstrated marksmanship ability over traditional background requirements. Combat veterans with unconventional training backgrounds were being recruited actively. Most significantly, the school had established partnerships with civilian shooting organizations to identify individuals whose natural abilities might translate to military applications. Instructor Rodriguez asked Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a former Marine sniper who had specifically requested assignment to Maria's course, "How do we balance the precision shooting skills you're teaching with the team integration that's special operations requires?" The question reflected ongoing debates within military circles about how to incorporate Maria's individual achievements into broader tactical frameworks. Her combat record was unquestionable, but translating solo performance into team-based operations required institutional changes that were still being developed. "Sergeant Torres," Maria replied, "precision shooting is only valuable when it supports mission objectives that can't be achieved through conventional means. The technical skills I'm teaching you are tools. How you employ those tools depends on understanding tactical requirements, team capabilities, and mission parameters that are constantly changing." As the morning class concluded, Maria found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from near dismissal to instructor status in less than a year. The leather rifle case that had sparked Colonel Mitchell's initial curiosity now sat in a place of honor in the Sniper School's museum, its 47 notches serving as a reminder that exceptional capability could emerge from unexpected sources. The broader implications of Maria's story continued to reverberate throughout the military establishment. Other service branches had begun reviewing their own talent identification processes, looking for soldiers whose capabilities might have been overlooked due to conventional assessment methods. The Marine Corps had established a pilot program, specifically designed to identify and develop unconventional marksmen. The Navy SEALs were experimenting with recruitment strategies that emphasized demonstrated performance over traditional background requirements. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Maria's success had challenged assumptions about military excellence that had persisted for generations. Young women considering military service now had an example of someone who had achieved elite status through merit rather than political accommodation. Male soldiers had been forced to confront their own biases about gender and capability. Most importantly, military leaders had been reminded that institutional prejudices could prevent them from maximizing the talents of exceptional individuals. The measure of our success, Maria told her students as they prepared for their first live fire exercise, isn't whether you can replicate the shots I made in Afghanistan. It's whether you can make the shots that future missions will require. Using skills that adapt to threats we haven't encountered yet, and equipment that doesn't exist today. Standing on the Fort Benning rifle range, where she had proven her capabilities 3 months earlier, Maria understood that her individual story had become part of something larger, a transformation in how the military identified, developed, and employed exceptional talent. The woman who had been dismissed for administrative reasons had become an agent of institutional change that would influence military culture for decades to come. The 47 notches on her rifle case represented more than confirmed kills. They had become symbols of what was possible when merit triumphed over prejudice, when exceptional performance was recognized regardless of its source, and when institutions found the courage to embrace change rather than defend tradition. As her students began their practical exercises, Maria watched with the satisfaction of someone who had not only overcome institutional barriers, but had helped dismantle them for future generations. The legend that had been born in Afghan mountains had found its ultimate expression in preparing others to excel in ways that would redefine military excellence for the 21st century.